This is part 2 of chapter 2 on the founding and the Constitution. So real quick, we want to look at some of the accomplishments of the Articles. We'll look at some of the weaknesses in a second. So if you remember that we said, well, if the United States no longer uses the Articles of Confederation, they must have been a failure at some level. But of course, there were some good things about them. So one of the primary things we can see here, the Articles established and organize the states so they could defeat the British forces. So there's no real national army at this time, more like a kind of a get together of different troops, say North Carolina militia, then Virginia troops, and so on. So it did enough to help us gain that independence from Britain. So then on the other side, let's turn to some of the weaknesses. So this is going to be one of the most important ones, this top part here. It says no central authority to resolve disputes. So think about if you have a group of states, but you don't really have anybody there to say, all right, at the end of the day, this is going to be the decision we're going to make, then you can see why that would have been such a problem. So one group of states wanted to do one thing, another group of states wanted to do another. Then, how do you come to a solution for that? So it's extremely difficult. Then just some other simple things as well. So no authority to raise taxes or troops, regulate commerce, thinking about business in these new states. And then also just things that, maybe they didn't think about at the time that were obviously very important. Say no common currency, which is another way of referring to paper money. So for example, North Carolina would have had their own bills, Virginia would have had its own bills, so you could see why that would have been an issue, particularly people traveling between the states and trying to do business, all that kind of stuff. So you'll notice all three of these bullet points, these are issues that we don't have anymore in our country today. So the new Constitution fixed all these things. So a few slides ago we talked about the Articles of Confederation being an exercise in trial and error. So these are some of the things that obviously would have been more on the error side. So I added this slide. This is some of the stuff that we wrote on the board in the class. So this is not in your in the notes packets that you've been filling out in class. But you can see I just wanted to highlight some of the key features of those Articles of Confederation. So a couple slides ago we talked about this key idea that the states had the most power, not the national government. Of course, that's different today, right? So today that switched, where the national would of course have more power than the states. So also during this time, we're thinking about that they just had one branch of government. That's just the legislative branch, just one house of Congress. So of course, today we have the two different houses, the House and the Senate. Back in those days, they just had one group, right? Just plain old Congress, no split in there. So of course that's different, right? Nobody's president of the United States. There's no Supreme Court, nothing like that. So then on the last slide, we were talking about this, the third thing, no central authority to resolve disputes. So that's just a fancy way of saying no strong leader. So of course today our federal government would be that central authority that would resolve disputes between states. So if North Carolina and South Carolina had a problem, the national government would step in there and solve that issue. Okay, then we want to turn to, so already at the very beginning of the country, you can see where it broke down into two major groups as far as how they wanted this new country to be structured. What did they want the government to look like? So one group, referred to as the Republicans, we talked about them earlier in the chapter. Again, that has nothing to do with the Republican Party of today. That they don't come in until much, much later in our history. So you can see here the basic distinction: opposed any centralization of power, meaning that they want it to be, most of that power to be at the state level. The other folks wanted it to be the other way. So the Federalists wanted a stronger government, stronger national government, more power at the national level. So the easy way to think about that, so if you remember we said national, federal, it's the same thing. So the Federalists wanted a stronger federal government. All right, so then to finish this little part up, we talked about different factions among the delegates, the people in the room. So a faction is sort of like a group or a division. So different groups or people with different ideas among those delegates. So just the idea that everybody in the room was not thinking the same way. Very different ideas about what they thought the government should look like. So, for example, some folks wanted more like this decentralized republicanism, more focused on the state level, or other folks, this guy's Hamilton, picture over here on the right, of course, he's on the $10 bill, it says near monarchism. So, why we say that is he wanted a president, but he said he should be elected for life. Of course, that decision didn't win out. Most people said, well, how is that any different than the king we've just been fighting against? But just kind of shows you some of the ideas that were thrown around in that room. So then we'll switch to one of the important pieces of the chapter called politicking and compromises. So we'll sort of see how they take these two different plans. At the end of the day, it kind of boils down to these two different plans, New Jersey and Virginia. And they'll take a little bit of one, take a little bit from the other, to form what we know as the Great Compromise, which pretty much looks like the Constitution that we still use in today. So this is all in the summer meeting of 1787 that we'll get to in a second. And then the last thing we'll look at is called the Three-Fifths Compromise, which of course has to do with the issue of slavery that was going on in the country at that time. So let's look at this Virginia plan. So you can see it's also called the Large States. So why it's called Virginia is not that exciting, just this guy Edmund Randolph came for Virginia. So large, of course, we're talking about population, not how physically big it is, like not how many miles it would take you to walk across it or something. So the states with a lot of people, they're going to say we want a national government with 3 branches. Of course, sounds very familiar to what we have today. Bicameral legislature. So again, bi, of course, means 2, cameral chambers. So 2-chamber legislature, or 2 houses, wherever way you want to look at it. But they're going to say both of them should be based on a state's population. So if you think about it, that makes perfect sense for them. They say, look, we have 10 times the population of other states, and we should have 10 times as much say in both of those houses. Then you can see the other 2 branches of government here, the executive and the judiciary. They say, well, just the legislature will pick them. Before we continue, did want to mention real quick, so you can see up here at the top, right? So this is what we call the Constitutional Convention. So this is held in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. You can see really a pretty quick time frame from May to July of 1787, right? Really just wrote this thing in the course of a couple months over the summertime then. All right. So if you think about it, again, this is, so if you look at, July 1776, for example, for the Declaration of Independence, so they're writing this almost 11 years to the date after the Declaration of Independence was signed. All right, so then we'll switch gears to the other one, so New Jersey plan, also known as the small states. Again, these are going to be the states that have less population, fewer people. So they're going to also have the 3 branches idea, but they're going to want just a unicameral legislature. So again, just 1 chamber, and where each state would have equal representation. So you can see from their perspective, they'd be worried about getting pushed around by the states that have large populations. They say, hey, why not just have everybody have equal representation? Just do it that way. So same thing as the other plan. They say judiciary and executive will be chosen by the legislature. Also expanding the power of Congress to do some other things, regulate commerce and so forth. And then this last piece is very important as well. Constitution and national laws would be the supreme law of the United States. So think about how that's a real change from the Articles of Confederation, where the main source of power was going to be at the state level. Now they're saying Constitution and national laws, right, at the top level, that's got to be the supreme law. Okay, and we still have that today, of course. All right, so then we'd see, well, how do they compromise on those 2 issues? So this is what we call the Great Compromise, or also known as the Connecticut Compromise. The guy Sherman happened to come from there. So you see, this is pretty much what we're using today. We do have a bicameral legislature, House of Representatives, based on population. So we looked at, some of the tiniest states population-wise just have the minimum number of representatives, just 1 person out of the whole 435. So 435 people in the House of Representatives. A lot of states just have 1 person for the whole state. Whereas, say, California is the largest state population-wise, so they have 53. So 53 out of the 435 coming just from that 1 state. So now on the other hand, the second chamber, the Senate, does have equal representation. So we're still using this today, right? 2 per state. So it doesn't matter how big or small your state is population-wise, everybody has 2 states. The one thing you'll notice on this slide that's different from today is it says Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures. So that did happen for quite a number of decades in our country, but a later amendment to the Constitution changed that. So of course nowadays, if you want to be in either one of these chambers of Congress, you have to be elected. So while we're on this slide, you can see, so House of Representatives, remember you're elected for a 2-year term. 2-year term to the House. And Senate's a bit longer though. So 6 years for the United States Senate. So I think we've already talked about, so 435 total members in the House of Representatives, of these voting members. So remember, like D.C., for Washington, D.C., for example, they have a congressperson, but that congressman is not allowed to vote on some of the more serious issues. It's more of kind of administrative things. Of course, then the Senate, 2 per state, gives us a nice round number of 100 in the Senate. So we have 535 total members, voting members of Congress. So real quick here, let me bring in here. So you remember we kind of looked at how does that correspond to the presidential election. So we looked at So I wanted you to see how those total number of people in Congress, in the House and the Senate, how that corresponds for each state to the Electoral College, which of course is the system that we use to elect the president. So this is from the 2012 election. So this number right here, right, 332, that is why Barack Obama is our president. Not the fact that he just happened to get more votes than Mitt Romney, which is of course known as the popular vote. So you need 270 electoral votes to win. So you can see he's well over that total. So then Romney, on the other hand, had 206. So if I drag my mouse over one of these states, so let's look at Oregon, for example. So you can see it says 7 electoral votes. So we talked about, well, where does that number 7 come from? So the electoral votes is just a reflection of the total people that each state has in Congress. So the easy way to think about it is if you take that 7, of course we know that each state has 2 senators. So those 7 electoral votes would mean 2 senators and then plus 5 in the House of Representatives. Or for example, if we go to Nevada, so 6 electoral votes would mean 2 senators, 4 electoral votes. So I think we looked as well that, again, if you look at some of these real small states where not a lot of people live, a lot of these states have the minimum of 3. So Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, all with just 3 electoral votes. So of course that would be the minimum, 2 senators and 1 person in the House of Representatives. So let's finish up this great compromise. So we've already talked about this idea that Congress will regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Treaties will be approved by the Senate. So we've just looked at the red and blue states and all that good stuff as far as the Electoral College. Again, that system that we use to elect the president, where we have, and that's the executive branch. So if you think about it, so remember, there's no president of the United States during this meeting. This is in the summertime of 1787. George Washington is not inaugurated as our first president until a couple years later in 1789. So they basically have to get the Constitution first, where we actually set up the job of President of the United States. Then Washington's able to come in as our first president, and we've gone from there. So I think we talked real briefly, though, about that this actually gives more influence to the smaller states, where, again, if we looked at those states with a minimum of 3 electoral votes, that even that 1 person in the House is more than they really should get. If you actually did the math, their representation should be something like 0.1% of a person. But of course you can't have that, so they have the minimum of 1. So that's why in reality they have more influence. So then the last thing, of course, we'll look at in a minute here as well. So they also set up these what we call checks and balances. So for example, the president has the power to veto or reject acts of Congress. So we'll go ahead and stop here, and the next slide we'll pick up with the issue of slavery.